This video is sponsored by Crimson Manifesto, Knuckles OX, Jopi, and Novak Daddy. Our story begins in the waiting line of incoming souls to King Yemma, as Pigero finally opens his eyes, last remembering the face of his lost friend Zeshin before staring down a key blast barreling towards him, spelling his end. Wait, why does he even have eyes to open? The young delinquent fighter then subsequently looks down to see himself intact, while his clothes are tattered and torn, still denoting the damage he succumbed to before passing on, while above his head shines a bright halo. While there is currently a lot on his mind, he however can't help but laugh a bit mischievously, as this can only mean that like Goku and Piccolo spoke about, he has been gifted his body in the other world, a distinction he hadn't expected, but was certainly grateful for, and one he would come to learn his reception of is all thanks to his master's other half, Kami, reuniting with the god of Earth after finally making his way inside the Oni King's check-in station. With the deity present to actually see the effect Gohan and Pigero have had on the self-professed demon he's connected to, he was obviously able to put in a great word for him after his first death, getting him all pretty lucky all things considered, since he did used to be the self-professed leader of a gang. While the experience of death in and of itself is shocking and all, Pigero, like Yamcha, is still reeling from the revelation that Zeshin and his crew apparently did make it to Earth, and from the looks of it, are now working for this Dr. Gero, or somehow have become androids themselves. The second youngest member of the demon school has little time to mope around or contemplate this mystery, as at the moment his hot-headed and now teenage nature really only allows him to process this with the idea of trying to take his mind off it for now. It's something a little bit easier to process and do at the moment, and so just looks at this as an opportunity to get a head start on the future, pretty much literally, since if he died this early on, they must have already drastically shifted around the timeline. At least this is what his knowledge of sci-fi movies suggests to him, though whatever keeps him sane works in this instance, which means he can always figure out what's going on later. After his recent loss to Krillin and being able to remember just how clutch Goku's Kaioken was in his first real battle against the Saiyans, Pigero is actually kinda thankful for this opportunity, both because he wants to learn from King Kai and take the opportunity to question if Goku or the Kaio ever meant to hand that technique out to the others. I mean, sure, he got the principle of it being a lot better suited to someone like a Saiyan who could benefit from damaging their body and then pushing beyond the very limits of it, especially in comparison to an Earthling who is much more likely to just hurt themselves faster and get a lot less of a reward from such a gamble. Hence Goku's pretty much mastering the technique for its creator. King Kai, of course, not likely to enjoy his casually throwing that feat of his adopted father's around. But in the end, neither risking his life or angering the gods are all too daunting a prospect to Pigero, as not only has he always had a pretty high-risk, high-reward outlook on things, but he's also been feeling a need for something to even the playing field, if only temporary, after running behind a Super Saiyan Gohan for the last year and change. Up until now, he's only seen 4 real options for someone like him. A potential unlock, which seems like a temporary fix at best, and to his knowledge he can't really have again. The Kaioken, becoming an android or cyborg as it were, and maybe the super buff form Master Roshi had showed he and Gohan a few times, though he obviously wasn't too sure about those last two either, so a chance for the Kaioken was just the best of a bad bunch. However, before he actually departs down Snake Way at Kami and Yemma's insistence, something crosses his mind. Something he hasn't really thought about for a while, and so he pauses to question King Yemma, wanting to know if the deity could tell him anything about his parents. Or wait, even if the king can't do that, then maybe tell him about what's happened to Zeshin and his crew. Thus, now bound by a genuine and rightful curiosity, Pigero begins further holding up the deity's line of souls bound themselves for eternity. Of course, as Pigero is both young, a bit crude, and still very much growing his resume of heroics, the Yoker King isn't really willing to waste more energy or time on him than he already has at Kami's insistence, and so ends up waving Pigero off, telling him to ask again in a few millennia, when he's done a little more than play second banana and ride the coattails of some half-Saiyan kid. Maybe around then he'll have the motivation and free time to do the favorite for him. Some may question why King Yemma would be so rude, but I think he will be clearly and kinda rightfully himself a bit insulted by Pigero's presumptuousness, as if he would be keeping track of the lives of mortals to such a minute detail to know this insignificant nobody's nobody parents among the tons of other faceless souls he directs to heaven or hell without as much thought as this boy breathes in or out with, or at least used to. At this, Pigero bristles, as it's after all one of the best chances he's ever gotten to uncover much about his past. So it's not like the crotchety old man can blame him for it. But not wanting him to mouth off to the man in charge of his soul's eternal resting place, Kami quickly hurries Pigero down Snake Way to join King Kai, assuring him their other allies will gather the Dragon Balls and revive him with haste, therefore making the young man consider how long he should take before he returns to the land of the living. And so, after having an extremely easy time with the challenge of crossing the million miles of serpentine direction, Pigero arrives to the tiny planetoid at its end, soaring up and greeting its Kaio for the first time face to face. And, as is customary, is given a second challenge of eliciting eliciting a laugh from the god to be fully welcomed to his planet. Thankfully, a life like his has blessed Pigero with both a sharp wit and a flexible sense of humor, and so he is able to quickly endear himself to King Kai by making fun of King Yema and Kami of all things, even sparing a few impressions at Piccolo and Goku since he knows them pretty well now too. While this is all pretty hysterical to the North Kaio, King Kai however is not spared any either, as repeating his blunt way of critiquing Piccolo's training/teaching style, he cites his criticisms, mainly at only taking the time to impart such versatile and useful techniques upon 3 of their fighters so far, when he should know by now as well as Pigero does that things were constantly so dire. As chaotic as things were, every little bit of power here and there could help out. King Kai bashfully tries to make a few excuses, but Pigero just correctly points out that even back against the Saiyans, the Kaio's techniques would have saved them a lot of pain. But eventually, King Kai can't help but feel at least a little silly, and so agrees with Pigero's point of view that something is always better than nothing. Especially right now, when foretold oblivion was the only other option, deciding to figure out a way to, as a group, teach the rest of the Z-Warriors willing and worthy of his training to use at least his King Kai fist. Speaking of, by now, Pigero needs to get in touch with the rest of the Dragon Team, and so through the god, speaks down to his friends on Earth, catching them on the lookout currently in the midst of regrouping, even with Vegeta's men, all just as shaken as him by this ambush of the androids earlier than foretold. As expected, everyone's processing things in their own way, with a consensus on their next course of action seeming to be reviving Pigero, then finishing up their training, and finding then finishing the androids off. However, tuning in just now, they miss exactly how Goku means to pull this off in so short a time, before Pigero ends up interrupting him, and here, he requests they leave him dead for a year like they did with Goku. Gohan is the first to voice his dissent with this decision. For one thing, he's really only ever trained without Pigero once in his life before, when it was absolutely necessary, though thankfully, he did have his daddy and Yajirobe there to help him out too, though it was still a pretty rough 6 months without his best buddy. Not to mention, he feels they always grow stronger together, with Yamcha and Chaozu feeling a debt to Pigero echoing this last sentiment, all while Vegeta and Tien decide to stay their tongues surprisingly. Then, Goku and Piccolo in the end decide to back Pigero's plan, in turn putting a pin in the idea of using the time chamber as Goku remembered for now, since it'd be better to bust out that secret weapon when least expected. In light of this, Gohan pretty maturely relents and tries to put on a brave face, noting once again there are still people here to help him out. So with this blessing, Pigero gives a temporary farewell, encouraging everyone to train hard, and stating they'll reunite before the 3 years are truly up. So in the end, Gohan keeps his head up, trusting his big bro's judgment and taking the opportunity to benefit from more focused training. From here, Pigero spends the next year with King Kai, honestly coming to enjoy his company a good bit, and somewhat putting his mentors to shame even further, as he is incredibly driven to master the Kaioken technique as quickly as possible, while notably not being all too interested in the slow time spirit bomb. At least for now, though King Kai still makes him do the exercises to actually learn it, and thanks to some of the ideas in spirit control training, the concept makes some sense to him. He also takes some pride in mastering 10 times Earth gravity to the point of it feeling natural to him finally, and so begins contemplating if he could take another crack at higher G's to show off to Vegeta. Meanwhile, back on Earth, as they try to return to normal, the Z fighters are a bit too nervous to go off-world again to finish their training with the Ardradians, instead deciding to stay linked up with Vegeta's forces after they've healed up and continue their training of their individual haunts around the planet, using these greater numbers to deter any more jumpings, making sure to keep vigilance over the Earth for any more sneak attacks, and to hasten their search for Jiro's lab, training through mostly simple sparring and the like. This really ends up making fighters like Zarbon and Burr wonderful training partners for the human Z fighters, as their alien potential allows them to catch up with them and then surpass them pretty quickly, giving our Earthlings something to constantly be striving for above Trunks' estimation. And even though the aliens aren't very impressive when it comes to martial arts abilities, under their new teachers with some instruction and technique, they slowly become students worthy of learning from his masters, with even cunning yet cowardly warriors like Kui and Goro having at least some contribution to offer, even if they are kinda jerks need to continue working on it. As this is happening, Piccolo, Gohan, and Yamcha lead the charge to collect the remaining Dragon Balls for when Piccolo is ready to be revived, with this unlikely trio also deciding to do some training together along the way. But while the Namekian and Hybrid Saiyan mostly hold a grudge against Pigero's killer, the Scarred Man is a lot more curious about this mystery behind the reappearance of refugee turned space pirate Captain Zeshin, having seen much of himself in the space boy like he did in Pigero. And so, when the quest is done, the former bandit ends up getting Bulma's help in creating a device capable of detecting the young man's ship full of guerrilla warfare trained children. It even goes as far as getting the help of Tien, who too had met Zeshin and has impeccable key sense, as well as surprisingly Vegeta, who has experience tracking spacecraft, as well as his own secret soft spot for Pigero, eventually seeing the search party following Bulma's ship detector to find the vessel abandoned and seemingly stripped of parts, while the whereabouts of all the orphaned children who made up its crew obviously remain unclear, just as Zeshin's android energy is also unable to be sensed, so we remain at square one. Though, this mystery intrigues Kami enough to actually ask Pigero's earlier second question himself, checking with King Yema if it were possible that any off-world entities had died on the Earth since the excursion to Namek off a hunch. Just like when Pigero asked, Yema isn't pleased for the extra work, but looks into the lower deity's concerns regardless, and eerily, The Ogre King confirms an alien death toll that is disturbingly close to the number of kids reported to be under Zeshin and his partner Bun's protection, at least back when they crossed paths with Bulma's crew on the way to Namek, as these were in fact the last survivors of what eventually went on to become Planet Frieza 43. With these clues, it's not hard to deduce that Zeshin and his friends may have heeded Bulma and Pigero's advice to seek refuge on Earth, only to be snatched up by the dastardly Dr. Gero, and then gruesomely experimented on to further his goal of revenge. Meanwhile, over the course of the year, Zeshin and Android 13 undergo repairs and upgrades along with the other obedient models, as well as Gero himself, using the data and new growth projections they have collected from the ambush on our heroes. In this downtime, however, we see Zeshin showing some derision once again, as he questions Gero's leadership, or at least his methods of going about getting through to 17 and 18, as well as his lack of use of valuable fighters like 16 and 21, having put so much work and resources into their construction, even propositioning that his master could always leave the task of reining in the rebellious twin cyborgs to him, seeing as he was their superior in make and model, but unlike the good doctor, power as well. But Dr. Gero by now has begun to rethink his leniency towards the extraterrestrial cyborg, coming to notice that his eccentricities may not be quirks, now noticing he hides a great deal of cunning and ambition, while 13 on the other hand seems to revel in all this discord, his opinion on what he thought was a teacher's pet coming to do a 180. Due to he and Zeshin coming to build a begrudging bond and partnership, spending so much time together strapped to tables with their cybernetics hanging after all. It's actually kinda hard not to bond like that. This is also pretty beneficial to Gero, since with 13's upgrades, you kinda need someone in the field with him to keep him in check. A task Zeshin as his so-called friend would be perfectly suited for. Regardless, once this is all completed, Gero plans to keep his hand close to his chest, not wanting to overextend now at the edge of victory. So for now, they shall put off their true attack until their originally projected date, with Zeshin seemingly complying to this order more than dutifully, while slyly slipping small devices onto the locks of the 4 sealed containment units holding their other android brethren, as Gero retires to his private quarters in the very underground of the lab, ready to work on something else for a time. In the final weeks of his otherworldly training, Pigero sees himself able to master the Kaioken about as well as Krillin had, and at King Kai's strict order, this settles at a 5 times increase, this likely just being the best a human being can manage without it being for one shot and one shot alone. Too much further, and they'd likely shatter their bodies and be immobilized. And even a 5 times would leave him unable to fight for a while if he had a living body. Though Pigero was certainly hoping all this use of it may prepare him for the pain when he's flesh and blood again. But still, even having accomplished so much, he feels stagnated. Somewhat irritated, Gohan was inevitably correct in his needing a sparring partner to maximize his gains. But, having also enjoyed Pigero's company, King Kai decides to throw him a bone. Plus, this is after all Goku's adopted kid, and he'd likely have to show that fight-loving oath this someday in the future anyway. Also, fun fact, since this is a verse in which some of filler is somewhat slightly canon, it's actually more than possible to interpret King Kai as knowing instant transmission in this universe. But there is also the comedy that could ensue from Pigero carrying the Kai and possibly Gregory and Bubbles with him back to King Yema's check-in station, since I could see him complaining about the whole way and King Kai getting some good banner out of it. They could also take King Kai's car, which I think Pigero would be quite interested in, since I could see him attempting to steal and joyride the classic vehicle nearly the entirety of his training. Regardless of how they get there, upon arriving, they board something called the Higher Plane, where they then travel to the planet of the Grand Kai. While this is certainly a fun trip and an exciting revelation of even higher deities, it is all to reach one man who shall act as Pigero's sparring partner before he finishes up his training completely. No, not anyone you're likely thinking about, since that's still way too above Pigero's pay grade. And while we're at it, it's also more than likely you know who, and West Kai wouldn't just happen to be there at the exact same moment. But if you've been paying attention to Pigero's elemental attacks, you know a meeting is pretty inevitable. No, there's an easier solution to Pigero's issue here. As King Kai introduces the young man to the concepts behind the training it takes in order to receive a lesson from the Grand Kai, the same lesson that so many other warriors blessed to keep their bodies of the other world train endlessly to undergo. And so he ends up introducing him to another Earthling from the North Quadrant, who's been dead and training for 2,000 years. Easily using his title to convince the man to accompany him back to his world to aid Pigero in finishing up his training with a few sparring matches before he returns to life. A prospect Pigero is pretty pumped for, wanting to see just how far a human could go if they devoted themselves to only a fraction of the 10,000 years of training it takes in order to be recognized at this level. This allows Pigero to, in his own opinion, make some very much needed last-minute further strides, seeing him in the end say goodbye to King Kai and his new friends, and then easily recross Snake Way as he's revived by the Z-Fighters, ready to face Dr. Gero and the rest of his androids, as well as Zeshin, all in order to put this mysterious grudge to bed and save his world. And so he reunites with Kami once again, moving down to the lookout to meet up with his adopted family of Z-Fighters, as they are left with very little time before future Trunks' worn date of 3 years comes to pass. But that's where we'll be leaving this story off. for right now. As you can probably see by now, this was supposed to be a bit of a slow down to train and reflect on the character we have so far kind of driven part, so we'll get back to the main plot and meet back up with Gohan and the others to see how much stronger they've gotten now that they've pretty much returned to a near canon setup for the last bits of their training for the android threat, next time ending off the android saga and starting this universe's Cell saga, which as usual I'm really excited for because it's just set to be a really exciting arc in this universe, also just because Cell will probably get a major beef up here. We may even see future Trunks reappear, or maybe even get to meet future Gohan. Plus, the Z Fighters will have to have a straight up fight with the androids, and Pigero will finally get to reunite with and confront his self-professed soul brother Zeshin for answers and payback. So make sure you do the usual YouTube stuff so you don't miss out on that next part when it actually drops, and with that said, be sure to take care of yourselves, and as always, go beyond plus ultra, and I'll see you guys next time.